everyone! So in this video, we'll be looking at the poem Love's Philosophy by Percy Bysshe Shelley. Before we read the poem, let's find out a bit about Percy Bysshe Shelley. So Shelley was born in the year 1792 and he died at the relatively young age of 29 in 1822. Ironically, Shelley died a quintessentially romanticist death by drowning in a violent storm, which really captured the incredible force of nature. Shelley was one of the big six romantic poets, with the other ones being William Wordsworth, William Blake, John Keats, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and also his friend Lord Byron. Shelley was famously an atheist, an advocate of free love, and a supporter of socialist philosophy. He eloped at age 19 with a woman named Harriet Westbrook, who was his first wife. But unfortunately, she'd go on to commit suicide after Shelley's abandonment. His second wife was actually Mary Shelley, who was the author of the Gothic novel Frankenstein, published in 1818. She was the daughter of William Godwin, a political philosopher whom Shelley admired. Shelley was friends with Lord Byron, and together with Mary Shelley and a couple of others, they would form the intellectual coterie called the Shelley-Byron-Pisan Circle, the word Pisan being named after the western Italian city Pisa, where all of them stayed at one point in their lives. He was also friends with romantic poet and essayist Leigh Hunt, and was also an acquaintance of John Keats, although the two of them weren't particularly close. Interestingly, Shelley had some major beef with Wordsworth, and perhaps this is best embodied in his poem To Wordsworth, written in 1813. I'd encourage you guys to take a look at this poem, as it embodies a scathing but insightful critique of Wordsworth from Shelley's perspective. I'm now going to read this poem aloud once, but if you guys want to read it on your own, you're free to click pause on this video and come back to it once you're done. The fountains mingle with the river and the rivers with the ocean. The winds of heaven mix forever with a sweet emotion. Nothing in the world is single. All things by a law divine in one spirit meet and mingle. Why not I with thine? See the mountains kiss high heaven and the waves clasp one another. No sister flower would be forgiven if it disdained its brother. And the sunlight clasps the earth and the moonbeams kiss the sea. What is all this sweet work worth if thou kiss not me? Now, the main premise of this poem is the interconnectedness of all things in the world. And this is an idea that actually William Wordsworth touches upon through his characterization of nature in his poem Tintern Abbey, published in 1798. So in his poem, Wordsworth refers to nature as a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. So this phrase, all things, echoes between Shelley's poem and also Wordsworth's characterization of nature. And so, since all things are intertwined, Shelley's speaker here is arguing that, well, by virtue of this law divine, which is an encoded sacred principle in the universe, that a natural union should also exist between him and his object of affection. But this, of course, is what we call a non sequitur, which is a conclusion that does not logically follow from the previous statement. And we've seen this non sequitur in a poem like The Flea, which is written by John Donne, the metaphysical poet. And in this poem, the speaker actually argues that because both he and his lover were bitten by the same flea, their bloods are fused, and as such they should mix, well, other bodily fluids, which is actually a euphemism for sexual consummation. So you see here, the speaker in Donne's poem says, "It sucked me first, and now sucks thee, and in this flea our two bloods mingled be." You see this word mingle here, again, echoes between Shelley's poem and Donne's poem. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is. Now granted, Shelley's poem is less sexual than Donne's, but their frame of argument is uncannily similar. Now the title of this poem should be of immediate interest to the close reader. Instead of saying the philosophy of love, Shelley titles his poem Love's Philosophy, which casts love in the possessive case with the apostrophe S. Now this personifies the emotion and imbues it with a life of its own. But the academic word philosophy also prepares us for a didactic tone in the rest of the poem. Now the poem opens up with water imagery, which introduces the idea of an integrated, boundless world. The opening lines present various sources of water, such as the fountains, the rivers, and the ocean. But the fact that they mingle with each other suggests that these are just names we ascribe to different bodies of water, and that fundamentally they are not separated, and there is no difference between them. They are all one and the same. Now, as we move into the next stanza, we see a widening of the scope of imagery from water to nature at large. Mountains, waves, sister flower, sunlight, moonbeams, earth, sea, etc. And we see the use of personification also drawing the realm of nature closer to that of man. Indeed, the idea here is that nature and man are but two sides of the same coin, bounded by this one spirit of love and union. Notice as well the growing intensity in kinesthetic imagery. From the gentler movements of mingle, mix, and meet in the first stanza, the speaker goes on to reference more aggressive actions like kiss and clasp. This reflects the dogged insistence in his pursuit of their romantic connection. So if all elements in nature can meet and mingle and kiss and clasp, then the speaker is asking, why shouldn't this also apply to relationships in the human world? The imagery in this poem illustrates the concept of what we call the sublime, which refers to elevated emotions and experiences beyond the normal, and a sense of overwhelming grandeur. The supernatural is an example of this. Now, just to help you all visualize this idea of the sublime, here's two representations of the sublime in art. On the left, we see a painting of a ship at sea by the English Romantic painter J.M.W. Turner. The strong, vivid palette of the painting, the energetic brushstrokes, and slight impressionistic vibe all bring to life what is essentially a rather static scene. But through the passion and colour, attention to lighting, and architecturing of composition, Turner elevates the seascape through his art, and as such makes the sea sublime. Now on the right, there's the famous Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog by the German painter Caspar David Friedrich. This painting captures an individual in a heroic stature as he looks down on a landscape interfused among a sea of fog from an Olympian vantage. You can really feel the grandeur of nature just by looking at this painting. Let's now move on to look at the alliteration in this poem. Now, I love the alliterative composition of this poem. It's very dynamic and interesting. So while the first stanza is dominated by semivowels and nasal sounds such as W, M, and N, the second stanza's emphasis is on plosives and gutturals such as D, B, and K. Now, perhaps this is more of a facetious point, but notice how when we pronounce the consonants W and M, our lips naturally pucker up and smack against each other, which are motions that either intend to seduce or convey amorous feelings, i.e., what the speaker is doing in this poem. The cluster of louder consonants builds up to a definitive climax as we reach the second stanza, and like the process of detumescence, the soundscape returns to the softer semivowels and nasals in the final two lines. what is all this sweet work worth if thou kiss not me? In terms of the overall shift from gentle to louder sounds and back to gentle sounds, this amplifies the speaker's voice and emotional intensity at the climax, which aligns with the sublimity of the natural imagery in the second stanza. So now we move on to form. On the surface, the form may seem quite regular, with 2 octaves, interestingly mirrored by the rhyme of fountains and mountains in the respective first lines of each stanza. And by the way, an octave is an 8-line stanza. But for all the insistence that the speaker makes on oneness and connectedness, the fact that there are 2 individual stanzas suggests the romantic distance that still exists between the speaker and his addressee. He hasn't quite won her affections yet, and so the gap between the stanzas is perhaps a visual reinforcement of this idea. But there's also a playfulness in the way Shelley handles the syntax of this poem to offset this impression of a gap. For example, notice the use of anadyplosis of the river and the rivers across lines 1 and 2, and the chiastic parallelism of kiss high heaven and clasp one another in lines 9 and 10, via V clasps the earth and kiss the sea in lines 13 and 14. Now what do we see here? We see a chained pattern created by the anadyplosis in stanza 1, and the vertical mirroring of the chiastic structure in stanza 2. Together, these syntactical arrangements reflect an underlying principle of unity and harmony, which binds nature and man and individual as one. Now finally, we get to rhyme and rhythm. There's a clear alternate rhyme scheme throughout the poem, but the metrical length of the poem's lines vary from 5 to 10. This contrast between rhyme and metre suggests the emotional turbulence that the speaker feels in his pursuit of love, despite the facade of suaveness he puts on. It's worth pointing out as well that the final line of each stanza, i.e. the 2 rhetorical questions in the poem, contain the fewest number of syllables, 5, compared to the rest of the poem's lines. Now if we look at what the 2 questions are asking, we'll notice from the negative word not that the speaker here is challenging his addressee and daring her to defy his invitations. But equally, he might be conveying a sense of incompleteness without her involvement. These 2 lines are examples of what we call catalectic trochaic trimeter. Catalectic because there is a missing unstressed syllable at the end of the lines. Why not I with thine? If thou kiss not me. So this missing syllable in the line could reflect the missing piece in the speaker's heart, which, according to the speaker, can only be filled up when his addressee accepts his advances. The overall use of trochees in poem, however, reflects the strong sense of insistence in the speaker's tone and will. My final point is about enjambment, and I'll make 2 observations about this device. First, throughout the poem, only 2 lines are sandwiched between a pair of caesurae. Line 5 is bookended by 2 semicolons, and line 8 by a full stop and a question mark. These lines combined embody the central argument of the poem, and that is, if all is connected, why shouldn't we be as well? By marking these lines out with caesura, Shelley conveys the romantic notion of the all-encompassing organic whole, which the speaker uses time and again to justify a romantic union. Note the series of antitheses between mountains and waves, sister flower and brother, sunlight and moonbeams in the second stanza. Although the realms of land and sea, female and male, day and night, are supposedly distinct, here they are fused in a landscape of oneness through Shelley's use of enjambment, as lines 9, 11 and 13 spill into their respective next lines. This arrangement erases any sense of polarity and culminates in a seemingly inevitable conclusion, which is signalled by the colon at the end of line 14. That's it, everyone! If you find this video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe to this channel for other GCSE and A-level English literature videos. I have a blog post comparing Love's Philosophy and Lord Byron's When We Two Parted, which you can check out in the description box below. Finally, leave a comment to let me know what you're studying right now and what else you wish to see from this channel. See you soon!